So there we go. Welcome. Welcome to the first webinar on healing trauma for the Atlantic section of the Alliance on Family Violence, helping survivors of family violence. We have, first of all, we want to do a land acknowledgement. Many of us come from the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq Passamaquoddy tribes. And we would like you to think about the traditional land on which you gather with us tonight. And my house actually faces the beautiful Wolastoqey River, so I have a view of it as we speak. And we're just so grateful for the original folk that lived in our country and share it with us now. So this is the program for tonight. We have two presenters, Jen Gorham, who's the Associate Director of Sexual Violence New Brunswick, and Leland Martz, who's a counseling therapist with Bridges Institute in Nova Scotia. What we're going to be doing is having them kind of lay a foundation of understanding about the neurology of trauma and then how trauma plays out within family contexts and the therapy that can be helpful there. We then will introduce a panel of family law practitioners whose role is to initiate the Q&A. So they're going to each ask a question of our presenters and have an opportunity for some initial dialogue, but we welcome everybody through chat to ask questions, and we'll offer those questions to the group as well. This just an acknowledgement here. This project is funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada and designed to address the unique needs of survivors of family violence within the family justice system. What we have done in 5 different partner locations, and you can see at the bottom of your screen, the logos for the different institutions. We all have what are called communities of practice. The community of practice are made up of a combination of lawyers, social workers, health professionals, in some cases, police officers. We have a couple in ours. And this is a group that gets together to discuss and dialogue around what we know in our silos and how we can cross those silos to get a better understanding of supporting survivors of family violence, so that when they are dealing with lawyers in the family law system, they're going to be in a better position to have healthier outcomes than they currently do. So the community of practice is here defined as an informal self-organized network of peers with diverse skills and experience in an area of practice or profession, held together by the members' desire to help others. And this is the team, the Atlantic team. Carla's our principal investigator. I'm the project coordinator. Anna Fusco-Virtue is our research assistant, and Kathy Holtman is the director of the Muriel McQueen Ferguson Center. And this particular project comes from Western University. So the national directors are Peter Jaffe and Katrina Scott. And there's a link to the website if you're interested in exploring that. So project priorities: to enhance supports of survivors of violence by providing training, guidance, and resource to family law practitioners that support trauma-informed practice, and improving the coordination of services in order to enhance the safety and well-being of all parties. To foster communication and knowledge sharing through cross-pollination. So without further ado, I will introduce Jen. Jen Gorham is the Associate Director of Sexual Violence New Brunswick, which offers a trauma training to volunteers and community members to facilitate best practices in dealing with survivors of sexual violence. And I've had her present to UNB law students a couple times, and she's a very good presenter. So I think you'll enjoy her presentation very much. So I'll let you take it from there, Jen.
Thank you. And I don't have a PowerPoint, so, oh, there, perfect. So I'm going to start by saying I'm home, and I have an anxious dog who's running around and a cat who's making the dog anxious. So apologize for any ambient dog cat noise that comes up as I'm presenting. So I'm going to start by saying that the information that I'm covering this evening is coming from a much larger training that we developed at Sexual Violence New Brunswick, SVNB. Well, we completed the project in 2019, and it was about developing trauma-informed prosecutions, specifically for Crown prosecutors. And so this is just a little snippet of some of the information that is covered in that training. And the other thing is, it is sexual violence specific. I will be talking generally about trauma, but it's important to know that when we talk about intimate partner violence or family law, of course, issues of sexual violence are present. So even though the trauma information is malleable to different contexts, this information is specific to sexual violence. So first, let's just start with the general definition of trauma. So trauma is an event that temporarily overwhelms an individual's capacity to cope. And it is typically attached to something that is very fearful. And so the analogy that we often give is that you have someone who is like a snow globe, and they're sitting on their little desk as a snow globe, and they've got a kind of sense of where all the little snowflakes are. And someone comes up, picks them up, and goes and sets them back down. And so the trauma is this kind of overwhelming sense of like, what's happening, what's going on, where are all of the snowflakes going to land? And it's also terrifying. And so these events can have very long-term impacts. They can be days, weeks, years following a traumatic event. The other thing to keep in mind with trauma is that it's contextual. So who you are as a person, how you are constructed, how you're put together is going to impact whether or not you interpret or experience an event as traumatic. Your previous histories, what you've experienced in your life, how you process fear, like all of the sort of building blocks of who you are also going to inform whether or not that experience is a traumatic one. And so an example I often give is if my partner and I are in a terrible car accident. In fact, we were one year. Let's just use the real one. We were driving on an icy road. We started to slide. We thought we were just going to slide, but instead we rolled. And so in that experience, I experienced trauma. That was fearful for me for years after. Just the feeling of ice on the road or the sound of that freezing rain can make my nervous system activate. Whereas my partner was like, well, we're not going on vacation this year. He's immediately thinking about the car and the cost. And so we had two very different experiences. Now, it could be because he was driving, he saw what was about to happen, or he felt it. He was able to kind of, in those microseconds that our brains process things, kind of have some perception of like, uh-oh. Whereas I was just looking out the window and had no idea what was going on until we were actually rolling. So trauma temporarily overwhelms our ability to process and cope, very, very fearful, and is also impacted by the context of who we are. So then when we talk about the neurobiology of trauma, a lot of times, particularly in the legal profession, there's this sort of question, and legal broadly, the justice system, like what are the benefits of understanding this science? And there are really three. It helps us have an understanding of why a person is responding to a situation. And of course, in this context, sexual assault. So what is happening? Why is this person behaving the way they're behaving? It helps us understand how memory gets encoded, because we have some really kind of false ideas about memory and how memory gets processed and encoded. And this gives us a clearer picture of what that looks like. And it can help when understand why the memory recall down the road may be different or difficult, or why they may be only able to grab snippets of a specific memory. But neurobiology is not a catch-all. Of course, when we talk about the issue of sexual assault, intimate partner violence, any gender-based violence, in fact, it's just as important to understand the myths and stereotypes attached to those issues, because they give us just as much information as the neurobiology of trauma. So let's dive into the neurobiology piece. We're going to start with Dr. Daniel Siegel. So Dan Siegel uses what's called the handy brain model. And I have a suspicion that Dr. Siegel is a big fan of dad jokes, because handy, get it? So This is Dan Siegel's handy brain model. So here we have the spinal cord. This is where the information highway, right? All of the information of our bodies and in our brains travels back and forth through this spinal cord. Then we have the brain stem, the base of the brain. This is where breathing and pulse and internal temperature and all of the things that are below our conscious control are happening. You know, without that, we couldn't function and live because we couldn't actually actively keep our hearts beating and our lungs breathing and our pulse racing. So that's where that lives. Then we have this middle part of the brain. It's called the limbic system. And the limbic system has all kinds of neat and interesting stuff, all kinds of great, curious things happening. But for the purposes of this presentation, what we're really interested in is the amygdala. The amygdala is like our guy in the watchtower. And if you are a Marvel Universe fan and you think about Iron Man's bodyguard, that's your amygdala. He's a little over-caffeinated. He's very eager. He wants to do a good job. So the amygdala is constantly scanning for these perceptions of danger and risk and like, you know, what's going on? What's scary? What's happening? The problem with the amygdala is that it can't differentiate between, as we've heard, the saber-toothed tiger or just stress, a chronic stressful situation. So it has a similar response to stress and or fear and danger. Then we also have an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which I just like saying, hippocampus. So the hippocampus, so one of the key pieces of information for the hippocampus is this is where memory kind of, it's not where it's processed, but it's how memory goes from this middle part of the brain to this top part of the brain we're going to talk about in a minute. Then we have this front part, the four nails. This is the prefrontal cortex. So in the prefrontal cortex is where logic, creativity, critical thinking, the ability to problem solve, that's where this is housed in the PFC, prefrontal cortex. When we experience stress, fear, trauma, we flip our lids. The PFC, the prefrontal cortex, goes offline because the amygdala basically sends out an all points bulletin to the rest of the body and brain and is like, we're in danger, things are bad, everybody stop, and a number of things happen simultaneously. We get a flood of stress hormones, and I won't go through all of them, but there's a lot, and everybody gets a different amount in different types in different ways, and we don't know why. The hippocampus shuts down because the brain is kind of like, we don't really need you right now, we're just about surviving. And we flip our lids and we are functioning from a fear-based brain. Now we're still taking in memories, we're still taking in content, but we're not encoding it. There's not communication happening between these two parts of the brain because it's not necessary for survival. We don't need it to survive this traumatic, stressful event. So that is really, really key to keep in mind. So until this part of our brain comes back online, we can't really start processing those memories and experiences that we've been having. So for me, when we rolled our car and I flipped my lid, once Matt got me out of the car, I was picking up the garbage. We had a skate that was in our car and it bounced around and popped out all the windows in the car. Thankfully, it didn't pop out our windows. But anyway, so all the garbage, because there was a lot, because we had little kids at the time, fell out of the car. And so I'm on the side of the road picking up garbage. We've just had this terrible accident. And Matt is like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, we can't litter. At the time, I am just functioning in this fear-based kind of shocked brain. And I'm going on these habitual rituals of like, you don't litter. And it wasn't until later when my prefrontal cortex had come back down online and I was starting to actually process those memories that I was like, what was I doing? Like the ambulance people must have thought, what, like, did she bonk her head? Because my behavior was so peculiar for someone who had just had a car accident, but really it wasn't. It made a lot of sense given that I'd flipped my lid. This is the part where I would ask if there's questions, but oh, good. Okay, No, there was a comment, but it's not a question. So that's hard. We'll wait till the panel. So if you have questions, jot them down. But the facilitator in me is struggling because I want to see if there are questions. Okay. So then what happens to our memories and those processes when we've experienced trauma, and in this context of sexual assault? We lose that PFC, we lose that prefrontal cortex. We have what's called bottom-up attention. So we're focusing on the bottom part of the brain up to what can keep us alive. What is going to save my life in this moment? We're going to have these very hardwired, evolutionary survival reflexes that are going to kick in, that are not part of what we can control. This is just our bodies telling us this is how we survive. There may be self-protection habits that kick in that don't seem logical in hindsight. And we may have altered memory and encoding. But what's important to understand is that the memories that we do take in are intact. They're correct. They just may have organized in a strange way in our brains. And we have all experienced this. Every single person in this webinar tonight has experienced prefrontal cortex going offline. That's a common human experience. So then that leads us into that discussion or that question of fight or flight. And we've all heard that, right? The fight, flight, freeze response. It's alliterative. It just rolls off the tongue. But it's actually an incorrect way to discuss the fear response, because it isn't a fight, flight, freeze. It's in fact freeze. And this is mammalian. We all do this as mammals. And some of us, it might be below conscious perception. Some of us, it may feel like, oh my gosh, I can feel that I'm freezing. But some of us, it's very, 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 very quick. It's the deer in headlights. It's a mammalian response to tracking danger. We stop, we assess, and then we go from there. Then we flee if possible. But if fleeing is not, if flight is not possible, we may fight to flee. So that's where, for some people, that fight response may kick in. Not always, but it might. And then if we cannot flee, if we cannot fight to flee, then that secondary freeze response may kick in. We may also see some self-protective habits, those polite responses. You know, we are socialized, all of us, to be polite. When we're in comfortable situations, we can all think of situations where that's happened, where we're like, I don't know what's going on, but this is really awkward, but I don't want to draw attention to how awkward this is. So I'm just going to polite my way through this. When in reality, in hindsight, we're like, why didn't I say something? That was so friggin' weird. But that is a socialized protective habit. We're also trained to have polite responses to aggression or dominant people when we think about, you know, nasty bosses, or we think about people in positions of authority and they're kind of coming down hard. That is an ingrained socialization, and our protective part of our brain is going to rely on that. And then culturally, we're just hoping and pretending that what's happening is not really happening. It's not a big deal. We've misunderstood. We don't want to make someone feel embarrassed down the road. So culturally, we're likely to kind of act like it's not that big a deal. If the freeze state does not work, if our brains, our fear-based brains, interpret, okay, you are not, this is like, I'm taking completely over here because this is an unsurvivable situation, then our fear circuitry may go to a very drastic state of survival reflexes. This is dissociation, tonic immobility, or collapsed immobility. So dissociation, we're all familiar, we've all dissociated. You get in your car, you think you're going to Walmart, and you wind up at Shoppers Drug Mart. And you have no recollection of the drive from your home to Shoppers Drug Mart. All you keep thinking is, I hope I didn't run any red lights. It's because you checked out. You were thinking about groceries or meal planning, or you're doing work for tomorrow, and we just went somewhere else. This is a common experience that we all experience. Tonic immobility. So tonic immobility is the fainting goats. We've seen those videos of the goats that just startle and then they just completely out of the frame. That's tonic immobility. We go into a rigid, paralyzed state where we cannot move or cannot speak. It can be sudden onset, and it can be accompanied with dissociation. So you can experience tonic immobility, and then your body checks out and goes somewhere else to survive. And then collapsed immobility. And again, if you've seen those videos of people on those slingshot rides at like fairs, so it's quite cruel, but I think they're hilarious. But usually there's two people and there's one person who's laughing their head off, and then the other person is kind of, and then they faint, and then they come around and then they faint. And seriously, you can fall down a well with those because they are humorous, but that's collapsed immobility. That is our body going, this is too scary. Nope, we're out. So it's like fainting, but you can come in and out of consciousness. And these are very intense, very, very instinctual, drastic survival reflexes. But they can also deeply impair our memories. So then, what is actually happening with our memories during a sexual assault, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence? The thing that I think most people misunderstand, and in particular the justice system, is that memory isn't linear. It is possible to remember things from the beginning to the end, but that requires our prefrontal cortex. We need that part of our brain to be online in order for us to sit down and give chronological details. So if we're thinking about someone going in to give a police statement, or they have to testify, or even in civil, when they're going through that part where it's with the information gathering, there's a language for it and I can't remember it. All of those can be situations that prompt this, because most people don't interact with the justice system or lawyers in their regular day. And so it can be stressful, it can be very fearful, it can be very intense. And so all of a sudden you're sitting across from someone who's asking you these kind of very intense questions, and you want to get the answers right, and it's making you stressed out. And so this is happening because, remember, our brains cannot tell the difference between stress and something fearful. The amygdala interprets it the same. So this concept of like, oh, well, they didn't give a chronological story. Well, of course they didn't. We tend to remember the most intense elements of an event. And this is true of happy events and scary and sad. And that is because that is what our brain locks onto and says is important. This is an important piece of this story that you're experiencing, so glom onto that. Which is why when you sit down with your siblings or family members and you're reminiscing and telling stories, someone will say something and you're like, I don't remember that at all. Oh my gosh. And they have a very clear picture of it because that is what was important in their brain and something else was important for you. When we look at trauma, particularly when we're hearing survivor stories, when they're detailing the events, you know, it's not uncommon to have a survivor be able to detail a very strange, innocuous, sort of random thing in the room, right? They might not be able to tell you the date, time, color of the person's clothes, but they can detail in graphic detail a clock on the wall, because that's what their brain focused on in order to survive in this moment. The fear-based part of their brain was going, this is how we're going to deal with this. And so that's what they focused on. And so getting back into sort of the crown training, and I'll step back out of it in a second, that's interesting because that is not consistent with a consensual sexual activity. You know, when we have fun, good, happy time sex, usually we can describe lots of different parts. We're not just hyper-focused on one item in the room. That is not consistent with a consensual sexual activity. So we tend to remember the most intense elements. We do tend to remember the beginnings and the endings. The middle part, that chronological middle part, is trickier. So again, you can think about like, oh yeah, gosh, I remember the beginning of the night we were doing this, and then I think someone said this, and then, oh yeah, and then this is how I got home, or this is, you know, and then I got into a cab and I went home. So when we think about that chronological story, that requires the prefrontal cortex. And we also tend to remember things spontaneously. Our memory is actually more significantly attached to our five senses than it is to sort of this logical, like, let's sit down and think about it. And we all know that. We have all experienced that. You know, well, this actually happened to me recently too. I hopped into a friend's car, and it smelled just like my grandmother's car when I was growing up. She had a Standard. There was just so much about it that was just like my grandmother's car. And immediately I was flooded with these memories of her driving me to Stanley Park and going to the Vancouver Aquarium, and, you know, and then I could smell popcorn. There's that popcorn they smell at zoos, and then the zoo and the monkey smell combined. It's a pretty intense smell. And so all of a sudden I had this overwhelming sensory experience of all of these memories attached to my grandmother. And so that also makes a lot of sense. So when we're asking people questions or trying to get information, starting with the sensory aspect of it, as opposed to the chronological story, can be a lot more helpful.
I'm going to just jump in and say we should probably just do maybe just a few more minutes, and then
I'm almost done.
Okay. So
yeah. I was trying to watch the clock, given that we started a little. So, and I think I've already gone over. So broadly, basically what I'm saying is neurobiology, it's a small piece of understanding a traumatic response of why someone might be behaving the way they're behaving, but it also can give you a lot of clues for why the person in front of you might be behaving the way they're behaving. And it can also give you clues about how to go about asking questions and getting the information that you need. Okay, sorry, I know I went over. I'm all done.
No, that was really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Jen. We're going to have questions for Jen after we hear from Leland, because we do want to not take too much time. So I'm going to switch it over now to Leland. Oops, I have to, sorry, share my screen here. So Leland Martz is a counseling therapist. He works at Dalhousie University with students, as well as doing counseling for Bridges Institute. And at Bridges Institute, he's primarily working with people who have harmed others or who have been harmed by others, particularly in the context of family violence. So it's a gender-based approach, but he also works with queer folk too, who have been in intimate partner relationships where violence has been a factor. So he's going to talk about his approach to trauma and therapy, and bring some insight into what can be helpful for survivors. So I'll give it over to Leland.
Thank you, LA, and thank you, Jen, for a great primer on trauma. I'm just going to share my screen now and share a few slides with you. Can I get a thumbs up on that, LA? Is the screen up? Okay, great. So I'm glad to be here to share some ideas with you all, and hopefully, augment your understanding of working with traumatized people in the intimate partner violence context. And I'm hoping this presentation is helpful to the extent it can contribute to you more effectively carrying out your respective roles and responsibilities in supporting families, particularly families that have trauma. So what I'll be doing today is sharing a 3-phase process for healing. I want to basically a 3-phase process, for repairing harm in the context of working with victims and perpetrators of intimate partner violence. So my objectives for sharing today are: 1, to provide a broader context for understanding the potential supportive role of therapy in the prevention of abuse, as well as the healing and repair in cases involving IPV. I'd like to highlight some specific ways that gender and trauma impact victim and perpetrator choices in the repair and healing process. And I'm going to speak more in this presentation about more complex effects of trauma rather than those physiological effects that Jen was just speaking to. I also want to review the concept of victim-only identity as an effect of trauma, of complex trauma that becomes a common barrier to repairing harm and understanding justice, people. Before I jump in, I just want to emphasize the importance of taking a non-shaming approach to working with people that takes seriously a critical social justice analysis and statistics on gender and violence, but that resists essentializing people in a way that assumes that identity is shaped the same way by social influences. I want to just quote for you a quote from the director of Bridges, Todd Augustus Scott, in a paper that's going to be published soon. I think he says this very, very well. And I quote him, "Men generally perpetrate more physical violence than women. Of course, this reality is also reflected in intimate partner violence. At the same time, we resist imposing this sociological analysis on each individual and couple we work with when abuse is present. We resist essentializing all men who have used abuse as powerful and all women who have been victimized as powerless in the context of intimate relationships. This approach recognizes that power is exercised in many responsible and irresponsible ways in relationships, regardless of gender, regardless of how much power people have. This process resists essentializing identity in a way that assumes that women, men, and non-binary people want to have different interventions based on their group identity. Instead, the process is guided by principles that apply to all. For example, being responsive to each individual's unique intersection of identities. This approach does not make assumptions about individuals' experiences and what they want based on their gender, skin color, or sexual orientation. And while we remain curious about how social forces shape people's choices, we do not assume everyone is shaped in the same manner who has this or has the same relationship with these social forces. This process is responsive to individuals and includes investigating their specific relationship to ideas about gender, culture, and sexual orientation. So in the past 2 years, Bridges has begun to reconceptualize the principles from which we offer services to people. I can tell you a couple experiences that have contributed to spurring this on for me as one of the team. I was primarily working with men who used abuse in groups and in individual therapy, but had my eyes opened when I had the opportunity to work with male survivors of sexual abuse. And what was interesting was that half of the group of men who were survivors of abuse were also using abuse or had used abuse in relationships. And it was amazing the difference it made to have them in a group discussing them as victims and survivors. So that was a shift for me in my thinking. Also working recently more with the queer community. I'm personally getting calls from people looking for support who only find resources that make heteronormative assumptions about violence and gender. I had, for example, a woman call me in a same-sex relationship who said, "I can't find anything that doesn't just assume that the man is men use violence and women are victims." And I can read between the lines, but I'm just finding the language really frustrating. That was huge for us in terms of people looking at our website or looking at publications in the past from us. So we're working to change some things in the way we use language and the way we talk about gender and trauma with regards to gender and sexual orientation and identity. So another thing is that as I learned more about trauma and as I began to work therapeutically with both victims and perpetrators of violence and abuse, I started to notice some symmetry between those who harm and those who have been harmed in terms of the effects of trauma on the body, brain, and on identity. Trauma doesn't discriminate, doesn't care whether you're a perpetrator or a victim. The effects and the injury to the nervous system is the same. And that also contributed to changing my perspective a little bit. So sometimes in looking at that similarity between those who harm and those who've been harmed in the context of intimate partner relationships, One of the similarities is the tendency to view and define ourselves as no more than victims of our own harming actions and or the victims of the harming actions of others. We can stay stuck in a victim-only account of life. And over time, this victim-only account of life impacts our sense of self in the world. It can become a kind of identity. Sometimes this phenomena is referred to as a victim mentality. In my experience, I'm calling it victim-only identity, is derived from the repeated experience of the effects of trauma and or shame. So there doesn't have to be trauma present for someone to present in a way that is in keeping with what I'm calling a victim-only identity, but oftentimes trauma is involved. And it's more of a complex effect of trauma. So if you think about those effects that Jen was talking about on the nervous system, when a person is coping over time, through time, ping-ponging between those nervous system states, between hyperarousal or hypoarousal, between the fight, flight, freeze, and the tonic immobility and the dissociation, their sense of self begins to adapt to that experience, and they start having it starts to alter the way they view themselves and understand their identity. So many of those who think and behave in a sort of victim-only sensibility are not aware or do not acknowledge that they've been victimized. So for example, many of the men that I work with, even though they have histories of being victimized, they don't see themselves as victims at all. And I'm going to talk later of why that's problematic. So for those who harm, this can amount to denying and minimizing and justifying violence and abuse, blaming partners, police, courts, their substance abuse or mental health issues, or their own past victimization. These are just some quotes that I've slightly changed, but are very similar to things that you might hear from clients. If they hadn't ... then I wouldn't have had to ... With shocking regularity, people who harm believe they are defending themselves or that they are entitled to use force with their partners because of their perception of what is fair. It's astounding how many people who use violence in relationships believe firmly and defend, oftentimes with striking sincerity, that they were defending themselves, even though there's all evidence to show the opposite. This is clearly one of the effects of trauma, when a person is unable to recognize at all the harm that they've done, or at least are justifying it because they feel that they were restoring some sense of fairness or that they were defending themselves. It's also a signal that there may be past trauma and victimization involved. So for those who have been harmed, this can amount to denying and minimizing the effects of trauma and the dangers that a partner or ex-partner may pose. May also mean a pervasive state of hopelessness that concludes that change just isn't possible, either for them or for their partner or ex-partner. Some of the quotes might be, "What's the point of leaving them and having nobody in my life? Nobody can tell me who I'm capable and not capable of being with. And clearly I'm not meant to be with anyone. Why do I always end up being abused? It's pretty obvious I cannot trust myself or anyone else when it comes to relationships." So these are some of the indicators that there's a victim-only identity. And I say victim-only because the person sees every experience as one that is contributing to a story of them being a victim. And this is an effect of dealing with the persistent states of and effects of trauma in their life. So just to say a few things about victim-only identity. So victim-only identity becomes also reflected collectively in the community interventions we place in order to support people. We can be stuck, usually with the aim of keeping people safe, seeing people only and exclusively as victims of harm or perpetrators of harm. So if victim-only identities aren't recognized and deconstructed, both in individuals involved in IPV and in the systems that support them, including the legal system, then those who have been harmed may be less likely to articulate their needs, may be more vulnerable to being re-victimized, and may be more vulnerable to harming others. And those who harm might be less likely to address the abuse and violence done to them in the past, and less likely to acknowledge and repair the harm they have done, and more likely to continue using abuse and violence. And those offering support and services will be ensnared by only seeing people as victims or perpetrators, thereby forcing people to either compromise their safety in the efforts to facilitate change or compromise their desire for change in order to keep themselves safe. I have many examples of this, and I can't go into total detail, but just recently spoke to a woman who, in telling her story of survival, stated that it took her a long time to realize that the system in place to support her, the legal system, continually forced her to choose between her need for safety and for her children, and the desire for the possibility of change for her partner, who she hoped to stay with in the relationship and parent with. So when she didn't agree to participate in charges against her partner, she had no idea that she would then be in a situation where she had to prove she was not alienating her kids from the father. And in retrospect, she reflected that had she agreed to press charges, her partner would have fought her, likely would have lost his job, ruining any opportunity for him to acknowledge his violence and work towards taking responsibility for it and repairing the harms to her and the children and their children. So how do we respond to harm, and how do we work with people who are stuck in a victim-only account of their situation, whether they be someone who's perpetrated harm or someone who has survived harm? And for many people, it's both. Many of the people I work with who use violence are also victims of it. And many people who have been harmed go on to harm others in certain ways. So how do we respond to that? And how do we help people respond to whether they've been harmed or whether they use harm? So I want to just present to you now the early conceptual aspects of a phase model approach meant to prevent and address this victim-only phenomena I've described and help people towards repair. And I'm hoping that there may be some relevance here in this context for lawyers working in family law. So the idea for this framework emerged out of about 10 years of conversations at Bridges and working with both victims and perpetrators. And both at Bridges Institute in Truro and also the New Start program in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. So in the most general sense, this model I'm proposing here attempts to create a sort of map for victims, perpetrators, frontline workers, police, CPS or child protection workers, therapists, shelter and halfway house workers, and even lawyers. So it conceptualizes a process that walks people through one, creating safety and stabilization, inviting agency and responsibility, phase 2, and phase 3, facilitating and repairing relationships and trying to create healthy relationships. So you can see that in both cases, both victim and perpetrator in a particular incident are walked through the same process. If you imagine it starting at the bottom of the triangles and working out towards the top. I'll explain the golden triangle a little bit later. So the objectives of this proposed map is catered to people who are traumatized, but it's not limited to people who are traumatized. The 3 phases are here described as seeking to achieve the following objectives. So phase 1 is to stopping violence and abuse, creating physical safety for people, recovering agency by attending to and diminishing the present effects of trauma, particularly attending from the bottom up to that nervous system injury that Jen was talking about. So in phase 1, we're attending to that. Talk therapy is not necessarily appropriate at this level, at this stage. At this phase, we need to separate people. We need to involve community supports to keep people physically safe and also to help them understand and attend to and regulate their nervous systems. Phase 2, preventing the relapse into violence, processing experiences of victimization, both past and present, and recognizing agency and responsibility and evaluating choices in past relationships. A very important phase, cannot be moved into quickly. If you move into phase 2 too quickly, we'll talk a little more about what can happen when you do that. And it's a very important thing for setting up for phase 3. Repairing harms, revising a person's identity and sense of self, and restoring agency and responsibility in future relationships. So what we've noticed at Bridges is that there's sort of 3 fields that have not always been sensitive to one another that are kind of represented in these phases, actually. For example, the justice field's not always been sensitive to the insights gained with regards to the effects of trauma on those identified as victims and perpetrators. Likewise, the trauma field, in its emphasis on safety, is not always seen the value in the notion of agency, responsibility, and change, or viewed justice as a process of involving those who harm and those who have been harmed in the repair of harm. And then finally, the domestic violence field, in emphasizing the role of gender in violence, has focused on trauma, often with women and not men, and has not been very wary of and rightly has been very wary of restorative justice options, for good reason. So what interventions and practices and supports are necessary for community workers, victims, and perpetrators to achieve, if appropriate, the objectives of each of these phases? So I'm just going to walk us through each one really quickly here. I apologize for the dense slides. I was trying to think of ways to avoid this, but figured it would be helpful for you to be able to read these. So in phase one, the emphasis is on the present. It's to create immediate safety and attend to the effects of harm. Many lawyers, I'm sure, are attending to people early in this phase. This often requires strong intervention by various community institutions and agencies. People are supported to accept that they've been victimized or that they have perpetrated harm. And people often complain that these measures are too strong or too weak for their situation. So it's important that service providers are clear on their role and that people are being helped to understand the intentions of any interventions that are done at this sort of phase. So this is about coordinating with community supports and agencies to establish a clear distinction in the present between victim and perpetrator. At this stage, it is important to have that distinction. Who's been harmed in this particular instance? Who's the person who's done the harm or persons that have done the harm, based on the facts of the case as far as they can be known. So coordinating government and non-government interventions in the community to facilitate necessary separation and safety. And attending to the present effects of trauma by helping victims and perpetrators ground themselves physiologically and understand the effects of trauma and the meaning of the supportive interventions in place. We've learned the hard way that when either someone who's done harm or been harmed or both is in front of us displaying those physiological effects, as you often as lawyers may experience as well, it's pretty hard to communicate. It's hard to use the prefrontal cortex to evaluate what's happened, to take responsibility, to recognize the harm that's been done. Very difficult to do that. So it can be helpful to understand what needs to be done in this phase, so we're not rushing to do something that's inappropriate given the level of harm that's been done on both the victim and the perpetrator. I work with many men, for example, who come as the perpetrator. Not only do they think they were defending themselves or establishing some kind of fairness or felt entitled even to use abuse, they are traumatized by their own violence and aren't recognizing this. They're actually traumatized by their own acts of violence and are in those states that Jen was talking about. So it's important at this stage to attend to that. Okay, phase two. In phase two, the work shifts from safety in the present to exploring the influence of the past in the present. In this phase, the hard line between victim and perpetrator becomes more porous, and both the identified people in the process begin to explore their histories and evaluate their actions, choices, and needs. In my experience, childhood experiences of neglect, abuse, and violence are often disclosed here. Safety at this phase of the work often requires very skilled workers, therapists, and a renewed vulnerability for people to see themselves in context. There's a growing recognition that we are all occupying multiple identities and are more than just victims, more than just perpetrators, more than just the social expectations that we've been enrolled in. So this is where therapy at this stage is really probably important, and it takes skilled workers at this stage. So interventions in this stage may include studying the ongoing effects of past and present trauma and how these impacted agency and responsibility in present relationships, attending to, processing, and separating past feelings from the present choices and actions as deemed relevant to the situation, studying escalations towards abuse and the full context of abuse and violence from multiple perspectives and identities, evaluating the role of gender and other socially constructed identities in choices leading to harm. For example, deconstructing the unhelpful aspects of trauma-influenced masculinity, which is AKA toxic masculinity, which is something that we're doing regularly. Again, without this phase two level, trying to move to justice or repair or healing is very, very difficult. But the work in phase 2 is very delicate, especially where there is a lot of trauma. And if you try and move too quickly into it, or you force it, or you skip it completely, problems arise. And I hope to get to talking a little bit about that when we go into discussion, hopefully. So that's phase 2. Okay, phase 3. I had a bunch of examples for phase 2, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to rush ahead. So phase 3, repairing harms, revising and reauthoring identity, restoring agency, responsibility, and relationships. So this involves potentially helping people out of phase 1, for example, partners or victims, by, if requested or permitted, a written or in-person apology that identifies and takes responsibility for choices that have created harm, sharing relapse prevention plan if relationships to continue, developing a repair plan even if the relationship is ended. That means addressing financial issues, fixing damaged property, or establishing co-parenting values. Exploring future possibilities for relationship with self and others beyond victimization and harmful actions. And reauthoring identity and developing new identities congruent with positive past values and future aspirations. Okay, so I want to say something quickly in this third phase, is it doesn't require at all a victim to have contact with someone who's harmed them. So at this phase, the person who's been harmed has a lot of say over what happens. They may never see that person again, or may never want to have contact with them again. But these objectives of phase 3 can still happen. That person may still talk about what they want in a future relationship, or they may, through the therapist or other community players involved, have messages sent to the person who's done harm to them, requesting what they would like for repair, and be very clear about that. And once they've passed through phase 2, they are very clear about what they need. And it varies greatly from person to person in terms of what people need. Now, briefly, that golden triangle represents the possibility of a victim and a perpetrator getting in the same room, or sending letters, or having direct contact with one another in a sort of restorative justice practice. That needs to be carefully done, obviously, but there is that potential. We've seen this happen at Bridges many times, and we remain hopeful that in some situations that relationships can actually be repaired after abuse. But in many cases, they can't be. But a person still has a lot of healing to do in terms of just recovering from the effects of trauma physiologically and in their nervous system, but also figuring out who they are now and who they're going to be moving forward in life. Okay, so this is my last slide. So just a little troubleshooting. None of these interventions actually stated in these 3 phases are new. What's new here is the need to conceptualize the work with people who have been harmed and people who harm in a coordinated way, even if there's never any contact with them again, between them again. Because the needs of the victim and the perpetrator may not otherwise get attended to properly. So sometimes like victims' perspectives and ideas for justice and personal healing get completely overlooked, particularly in the legal system. And likewise, the need for the perpetrator to take responsibility and change can be overlooked. It's not considered in the context of the harms done to the victim. I had a fellow very recently who was in prison for quite a while for harming someone, said, "I get more out of a half an hour with you than I did my entire jail sentence." Now, I think jail was probably appropriate for him, but he wasn't getting what he needed from the time that he spent in prison, which was the opportunity to take responsibility and understand the context in which he harmed someone else. And he was very eager with me to start that process. So a few key considerations here. So apart from some of the community interventions in phase 1, these are optional. There's no obligation in this process to go into phase 2 or phase 3. Also acknowledgement that each phase could take days, weeks, months, or years. You know, I'm sure some of the family lawyers, you probably see people in these different phases at different stages in your work with them in the legal system, which would be kind of interesting. So sometimes people are ready for phase 2 work. Other times it can take several years before they're actually ready to go into that second phase. And victims can move at a different pace than perpetrators. Sometimes victims move very quickly through those phases. They know what they want. sometimes those who harm, and the perpetrators, sometimes they move quicker actually than the people that they've harmed. So there has to be attention paid to that. So there's also problems associated with community workers and supports like myself being centered in only one phase in the process. So that's something for a longer conversation. But a common problem I see now that I use this process as a lens is that people are often stuck in that victim-only identity, stay stuck in that phase one. And they have very little agency, and they don't understand how the legal system can help them. Or they're out for revenge and miss the opportunity to understand in a more fulsome manner the other possibilities for them for healing and repair, whether they've done harm or whether they've been harmed or both. So I'm really interested in how this process might be helpful, this lens might be helpful for lawyers in family practice, especially in light of the new Divorce Act in New Brunswick. So I don't know if there'll be any questions about that. So just also to say, in our clinical supervision at Bridges and New Start, we actually have been joined by a family lawyer who's looking for new ways to engage her clients. And it's amazing the resonance that we have with her in our meetings, actually. It's been really helpful to get her perspective as well. So thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Leland. That was very rich, and I'm sure we'll be unpacking that for a while. I'm just going to shift. Okay. So I'm going to introduce, we have 4 family lawyers with us on the panel who are going to open the Q&A. Now, we've already gotten a few questions, which is awesome. Keep them coming because Carla's going to take over asking those questions in a moment. But we're going to start with our 4 family law lawyers. We have with us Kelly Driscoll. Oh, I think there's a slide. Just sorry. I'll just flip my screen. Right. There we go. On the far left, we have Jen Davis, who's a relatively new lawyer. She was called to the bar in 2019, but prior to that, she had a lot of experience as a senior labor relations mediator. So her focus is around resolve legal and ADR services, so alternative dispute resolution. Kelly Driscoll was called to the bar in 2009, and she has had her own practice since then. She's been very involved in the Fredericton Legal Advice Clinic, and she works with her clients to try to get the best outcomes and to listen very well to the kind of language that's appropriate for them. Duarte is a new lawyer in New Brunswick, but practiced for 7 years in Colombia. And her primary area of focus is family law and immigration and refugee law. And Spencer McInnes was called to the bar in 2018, and she practices in family law and criminal law. And she's also very involved with the Fredericton Legal Advice Clinic. So why don't we just turn it over to you, and I'll let you open up with questions for our speakers.
Which one of us did you want to go first?
I was realizing I probably should have. Well, you're there, Kelly, so why don't you take it away?
Okay, so basically I found both of what Jen and Leland had to say really, really interesting. But I'm very much focused as a family lawyer on what does, what does this look like in my practice? So for example, just maybe to kind of bring it back down to just a level of how does this affect my daily life and how I go about and do my job. What are some of the things that I, as a family law lawyer, might inadvertently do that could cause further trauma to the client who is sitting in front of me and who has experienced family violence?
That's an excellent question. I don't know either of you could answer that.
I'll leave that one to Jen. I think that's a good one. Yeah, because you started to address that really well.
Yeah, so not being familiar with family law, but I did a little work with a civil lawyer here in Fredericton. It's the discovery. Is that what that's called? The discovery process? Thank you. Okay, good. So I think one of the first things is and I think everybody's guilty of this. This isn't just the justice system, but this is the medical systems, like all systems. We work in them, we're used to them. This is where we work. But for individuals accessing them, this is unique. This is scary. This is weird. An example I often give is if I went to the Dr. Everett Chalmers Hospital here in Fredericton for tests, and the person said, oh, I need you to go up to 4 Northwest, put a purple gown on and stand in a dark corner till someone comes. I'd be like, oh, okay. Because I don't know what the rules are. I'm just doing what I'm told. And so a lot of times I think that's missing, is a bit of an orientation. Like what is going to happen? What can I expect? And that might need to be explained multiple times if we're thinking of someone who's like this. The other thing that came up when I was working with the civil lawyer here was in the discovery process. Again, people don't know the rules. They don't know if they can stop and say, I need a break. I need time. I need to have a drink of water. I need to go for, I need a breath. So having specific break times, checking in regularly. It's not infantilizing someone to say like, are you doing okay? Is everything fine? Do you need to take a drink of water? And then I know that one of the experiences is when the discovery is happening with the opposing counsel, sometimes they can ping pong through content. So it's like, oh, we're talking about this, and oh, there was this terrible event that happened over here. Okay, question. Oh, back to this. Oh, now I have a question about that again, and back. And so like that's, so trying to keep any conversations, any questions, content that is significantly around a traumatic event tight, keeping it contained to, we're now going to discuss this. Once it's over, we're going to take a break. We're going to move on. Are just simple ways that folks can not have a good experience, but maybe not have as traumatic experience or as stressful experience when we're interacting with our clients.
That's really, go ahead, Leland.
Well, I would thank you, Jen. And I would just add briefly that, once you're able to recognize the effects of trauma when they're happening in front of you, this is so good way of remembering it. And once you can recognize that, then you can, and also develop a sense for the bigger context of what healing and repair might look like for someone. Then you can know when maybe to refer them to see a therapist, because you might be struggling with them as a lawyer, even just communicating with them yourself, let alone in court. Also, you'll have to learn to move with them. So they may in 1 minute be reacting and saying things that later they completely contradict, not just in terms of facts, but in terms of what they want. So if you understand the effects of trauma and you have a larger idea or context in your mind of what a person needs to go through in order to repair the harm that's been done to them or take responsibility for the harm that they've done, then you can ride with them a little more. You can refer them. You can develop a sort of Rolodex of techniques yourself, and also places that you can refer people to get help.
Thanks, Leland. And just, I'm not going to do much commentary, but just, when you think about it, both of those responses were geared towards being in that person's corner and making it as comfortable as possible for them. But when you think about a discovery, as Jen was describing, or about a trial process, cross-examination is fundamentally the opposite of that. You're tearing that person's testimony apart, but in the process of doing that, you may actually be inflicting real harm. So there's a range of how family law lawyers practice, but I do think that we kind of have people that are mindful about trying not to inflict harm, even in cross-examination. And sometimes there are still maybe slightly more old school lawyers out there who basically it's war, right? Like it's about getting the outcome for your client that you want. And if you can discredit the other client by making them sound crazy on the stand, well, that, you know what I mean? So the system itself in that sense can be extremely traumatizing. So I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to add any more commentary, I promise. But I would like to go to Jen Davis next and ask what your question is.
Well, I have been listening to this in absolute fascination and a little bit of distraction with the daughter in the background, so my apologies. But Jen, your description of the physiological and the sort of neurological things that are happening in clients, I see all of these indications with clients, even, you know, someone who I met with today. Where my question is obviously we are not trained in the same way as yourself or Leland, or we don't have that sort of experience. We don't have that expertise. I don't want to be the armchair psychologist or the armchair therapist for someone who is going through these difficulties. I'd like to try to help them navigate the legal aspects of their situation, because we're not going to be able to avoid that. But how am I able to, how would you suggest that I encourage my own clients who either find themselves on the victim or as a victim or a perpetrator in family violence? How are we to encourage them to seek out the other sorts of services that they will need in order to get to a place where they're able to, especially I'm thinking of cases where there are children involved, where there is nonetheless going to be a long-term relationship between perpetrator and victim. How do we funnel them into the right services where the legal aspect is not necessarily going to get them the results that they in fact need as human beings? How do we do that? How can we best help our clients then?
So yes, I mean, in our world as well, it's Sexual Violence New Brunswick and callers to the line who are looking for those sort of justice responses. A lot of times, you know, I think in many, not just sexual assault, but any court process, people are putting all their healing eggs in the court basket. When I get this verdict, when they go to jail, when I get custody, when I get, you know, then I will be, right? And that's a very dangerous game to play, because one, we know often people are not getting the results that they want or expect. Particularly in sexual violence, they never meet the expectation. And family law can go in, I mean, it's such a complicated, family law can go off in so many directions. So very rarely do people get their sort of healing needs met from any type of justice, civil or legal response. So have your lists. Do your homework. What's in your community? Who do you know? Like having those things available in advance. Who are the counselors in the community you like? What are the resources and those, like having them in advance, and then being upfront and honest. This is, you know, I'm so glad you shared this with me. It seems like it's, you know, this seems to be an area where you're really struggling, and I want to make sure that you have your needs met, and this is so far outside my lane. I'm just going to provide these resources for you. It's not, you're not kind of going, don't say this to me. You're not shutting this person down. You're just owning the limitations of what your role is. We talk about this with police officers all the time. You know, an officer will take a statement and slide the card across the table and say, oh, call me for anything. And we're like, stop saying that. They mean call me for anything in the context of evidence. They're going to call them for anything. We're like, don't do that. So it's okay to really define your parameters, define your boundaries, have your top 10 resources in your pocket, and just be transparent and own, like, I can see you're struggling. I can see this is causing you grief. I want to make sure you have the right supports. Here's a list that we have that I give to my clients. These are people I trust or that we vetted or whatever. And so you're not shutting it down, but you're keeping things in your lane.
If I could just have a follow-up to that as well for Leland. I'm familiar with a little bit of the kinds of pilot projects that are going on in your corner of the country, and the sort of interdisciplinary teams that are approaching justice and mental health and these sorts of issues and family violence. in terms of, we get instructions from our clients. We represent our clients' interests. We can influence that and be persuasive to a certain extent in terms of where the courts are likely to fall in terms of a decision, and counsel our client in that respect. But how do you suggest that we can, so I'm a mediator at heart, and how do you suggest that we can pull in those other, in the absence of these projects that are happening, or a wonderful system that is designed in such a way, how can we as family lawyers pull in the resources to get an interdisciplinary approach? It's so siloed now. I'm interested in your thoughts about the interdisciplinary approach to that.
Well, some of the projects that are going on have really contributed to that interdisciplinary, to that cross-pollination, right? The domestic violence court in Halifax, it's still a pilot. And there's a wellness court in Truro now that's a little bit different, but kind of operates the same. And it puts lawyers and therapists and social workers all in the same room to discuss a case. It's really helpful. It's an ideal way to go about it. I think that you're probably not the only lawyer who really at heart wants to be a mediator. And I think there, like, it's interesting because that the family lawyer that joins our clinical supervision, our peer supervision, is also of that same irk, wants to do good mediation. And I think that, like what Jen said, was just couldn't have said it better. Like, know what you're looking at, know when a couple or a client is ready for mediation, when they're absolutely not, to avoid a disaster for yourself and for them, not only harming them, but disrupting the process even more. So how you can draw those resources in, you caught me out a little bit there. I think within these projects, I see lots of opportunities for that. Outside of that, you're going to have to go out of your way to have conversations with therapists and shelter workers and transition house workers and probation officers. And, you're going to have to be picking up the phone and talking to those people and trying to get a sense for where that person is at. I don't think it's impossible, but with all the work you already have to do, I think it's pretty challenging. And, I think for some of you too, you just want to stay in your lane and do your job. I totally respect that as well. So I hope that somewhat approaches an answer to that. Yeah, I want to see more of these projects happening. When child protection's involved, there's case conferences. That's another opportunity. But where child protection isn't involved, very challenging, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Leland. I'm just getting mindful of the time. I would like for Heil and for Spencer to have a chance to voice their questions. And then we have a few in the chat. And so we'll ask Heil if you want to ask your question next.
Thank you, Elaine. I was wondering about if there is something like a structural trauma. I mean, I was thinking when Jen was talking about the response, about the polite response, I think for a person, for example, an immigrant or a Black person or a colored person, an Aboriginal, they could think, if I say something, I can be in jeopardy. They could be in fear if they speak up, or because the experience of previous experience with the police, bad experience with the police, a Black person can say, no, we are not police callers. We don't call the police in this family. We don't do that. We deal our problems ourselves. Because there is already, so the family court, the judicial system, it's a system of authority, and kind of white authority. We have to recognize that. So a big part of the population can be afraid of the justice system, and if someone can reach the justice system, can go to the police or go, at first they will be, I think it will be fear to even talk to a lawyer. And be scary on going to that path or even not going. So that my big question is, there is something like a structural trauma, there is something like that?
Jen, do you want to try?
Sorry, don't go ahead.
Yeah, well, just very challenging issues because now we're bringing culture and cultural identities in and past experiences as well. I think having up front is a process that is very sensitive to explain to people at every stage along the way what may be required of them and what may or may not be helpful. And again, to maybe even be able to distinguish where it's about trauma and where it's just about cultural norms. I think that could be that's splicing very fine, but I think very important to be able to be curious about those differences. Take the time to get to know your clients so that you can understand if there is actually a distinction there. Yeah.
And I think the biggest barrier is what you said in the question was, are folks from racialized groups even coming forward? Like, are they even going to come forward? You know, like when we look at our justice system, I mean, come on, it's for the queen, like the colonialism of it, right? Like it's inherently set up already as this super settler, like all of it, you know, is so terrifying and scary, and then steeped in racial injustice just in the history of our country. So getting people to come forward and seek support is the biggest barrier. Then we have all of the other hurdles of getting them through the different systems. But you know, having trust in the justice system, having trust in social workers, having trust, you know, when we talk about family court and we're talking about working with social development, so social development here in New Brunswick would be like child protection. What a fraught system for so many people who come from experiences of oppression. So right there, we've got the barrier, and that's where the work has to happen, and that's got to work at those systems. Like this isn't on the individuals who are experiencing oppression trying to access. That's not their work. This is systemic work that we got to do. That's on us to kind of figure out how our systems can improve so that people can feel like they can access the services, access the support, access justice, access medical, all of those systems.
Excellent question. Excellent responses. Thank you so much. And Spencer, your turn.
Thanks, LA. Just mindful of the time, I'll keep mine brief. So with the changes to the Divorce Act recently and the Family Law Act in New Brunswick, one of the duties that family law lawyers have now is to promote and kind of recommend to clients that alternative dispute resolution and mediation and a more focus on collaborative law versus litigation-based adversarial law. And so do you think it's possible to be engaging with clients, both perpetrators and survivors of domestic violence, in a mediation-based dispute resolution? And what kind of, you know, precautions should family law lawyers keep in mind to prevent re-traumatization or, you know, different impacts that clients and different responses those clients might have?
I'm excited about this question. This question is really of interest to me because I'm excited about these new ways of going about dispute resolution that are non-adversarial, but I also have really grave concerns if it's not done properly, or if you move people too quickly through a process like that. So the idea behind that phase model that I was looking at, I mean, I could do without phases. I'm not all interested in stages and linear or whatever, but it's a way of creating a map to be able to identify when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate to engage in those kinds of relationships with people and move them forward. So I think that being trauma informed is of crucial importance when we're thinking about mediation or putting people in the same room to talk. So I think lawyers are going to have to be quick studies in being able to recognize the effects of trauma and where people are at, and whether, you know, you don't want to put someone who's harmed someone who, you know, who's taken a lot of responsibility for the harm that they've done and want to make amends and want to repair harms in a room necessarily with someone who wants to hurt them now and get revenge on them. And then, of course, vice versa. You don't want to have a survivor put in a room in a mediation with someone who's actively gaslighting them, manipulating them, continuing to abuse them from a distance. And so I just think in order for those kinds of practices to work, it can't just be, the court's going to have to be bigger. There's going to have to be other players involved who can speak to the context of what's going on. Yeah, it's a great question and very important to move in that direction, but with extreme caution and care.
Well, that was a great answer. Thank you. And I'm excited about what the future holds. So we're going to turn it over to Carla now, who is with us. She was able to get in and she's going to head up what's left of our time with the Q&A and then do the closing.
Thanks, LA. Such a great time to be alive here with the technological wonders of the universe. Thank you all for your patience. Okay, so we have some great questions. There are quite a few of them in the chat. So what I'm going to try to do is combine a couple of them and see how that works. So one question that's come in, I think actually it's likely directed at Leland given the timing, but Jen, you're welcome to jump in as I know you will. So it's about how clients, especially perpetrators, get referred to you. Does this happen voluntarily or on a court-ordered basis? And then I'm going to tag onto that this question from someone who's specifically asking about Nova Scotia and how to access these kinds of therapeutic resources, particularly in a kind of pro bono, no money, no insurance kind of situation. What's the sense of what resources are available there, how people can get referred to them?
Okay, really quickly, we receive referrals from all kinds of sources. So a lot of them are court mandated through probation. In those cases, we still call partners. So we call partners and offer them support at no cost if they want it. And of course, that doesn't mean any contact between the client who's being court mandated through their probation order or undertaking to receive counseling. We get people coming in off the street just from the community who know who we are and want to start addressing their issues. CPS or Child Protection Services through what's called Policy 75 often drop contracts for us to do work, particularly with families who have had child protection involved. So that's another source. We've even now have Crown attorneys referring directly to us in cases where they know they can't make charges stick, but they just can't bear to send people out the door without support. And we're really happy about that relationship and where that's going. With regards to pro bono services, we work on a sliding scale. We're rare. There's not enough services out there. And even on a sliding scale, for some people, $20 is too much. So a lot of the times we do pro bono work as well. I've done it many times. It's a matter of contacting Bridges Institute or the New Start in Dartmouth. But again, we're thin with our funding. We're just hanging on all the time. Jen's nodding, and there needs to be more services. Obviously, I'm excited that as the court expands the kind of services it offers with people, I think it's going to mean that there's going to have to be more services outside. So that's another reason I think for pushing those projects. Hope that answers the question. And
I think just to add, depending on where you are in the country, that's part of the homework of what's in your community, is finding out how that does work. So like for example, here at SVNB, if an individual wants to access our in-person counseling, which is only a local program, they have to call it self-referring, and we have to speak to the individual, and our counseling services are at no cost to the client. But again, like Leland said, woo, not much money in that. So it's a very compromised service that we hold on to tightly in order to try to keep going.
I should just say one more thing. Our interagency meetings crucial too. So the Crown actually attends, Sexual Assault Center attends, Transition House, the Women's Shelter, our program, and we're talking on a monthly basis. So we're trying to help each other also.
Thank you both. Okay, so this one's a little bit more about staying in your lane. And it's about, the question is, how can professionals who are involved with survivors and perpetrators of family violence better recognize the boundaries of their expertise and when they need to refer? Big question.
Go ahead, Jen. I actually would like to hear what you have to say too about this one. I've enjoyed your feedback.
Well, I mean, I think that similar to what I had said before, it's also just a gut feeling. Like if all of a sudden you feel like you're answering questions that you're like, I think this, or I didn't go to school for this, or this is not what, you know, like we have sort of our organizational parameters, boundaries. But once we start in a place where we feel like we're answering questions that are not, this isn't our area of expertise, then that's the sign that you are now in someone else's lane. And honestly, the best thing to just say is that you don't know, or to say, this is outside my lane, this is outside, like you want to be very, very clear with your boundaries. Boundaries are what is going to sustain you in this work comprehensively, because people are scared and people are nervous. And if you are compassionate and empathetic and good at your job, you could very easily transition into someone who is more than just the role that you're designated with. So and that is actually dangerous and the opposite of trauma informed. You know, trauma informed is very clear boundaries and being clear and upfront. So anytime that you feel like you're drifting into questions that are just sort of outside your work world, that's when you're pausing and you're articulating that this is outside my work world. I'm not shutting you down. I want either time to get the right information or hear the resources that are good for you to connect with.
Excellent. I would only add that if you're across from a person who, and your interactions with them are 95% characterized by them reacting emotionally to you, that might be a sign as well. I have all the time in the world as a therapist to sit across from someone who's reacting to me. That's what my job is. So for you to, it's very difficult to do that with clients, as I'm sure you know. And I think that instead of trying to help them with their reaction, or God forbid, getting into a kind of power struggle with them over something that they have a problem with, and that's also timed maybe a signal to refer.
Okay, so our last question for the evening is very practical. So it's about what kinds of tips would you give from a kind of trauma-informed perspective for a client that needs to testify? So something that helps address their stress or anxiety or a kind of triggered trauma response. So very pragmatic.
I'm happy to take that one away, just because we did a whole training on it. Again, so here in New Brunswick, we have an organization or a group called Victim Services. Typically, Victim Services, when they're working within the justice system or the criminal justice system, they do the orientation, right? You get to go in and tour court. What are things going to look like? Where do you come in? Where do they come in? Where is everybody sitting? If a similar process is available to you within a civil context, maybe not through Victim Services, but even just your own self, kind of doing a little orientation, that is incredibly helpful, because again, it's weird. You know, I've been to court a handful of times just to go in to watch, and the whole process is so weird, and it's so informed by television, and it's completely the opposite of TV. So that can really be helpful. People instinctively are going to want to fill in the blanks when they don't know an answer, or they feel like they've given a poor answer, or they say, I don't know. It's just human nature to want to fill in the blanks, and really, really trying to get them to just the facts, ma'am. Like, stick to the answer. Don't feel the need to kind of fill in those blanks or elaborate, or that you've given a wrong or a bad answer because you didn't know. So having them have that information. Water, they need to have water, they need to have water, and they need to have water breaks, and they need to have pee breaks. You know, when you start to notice people's mouths are going pasty, when they're done their water, these are times to call for breaks. These are times to move, because we're holding tension in our bodies. And you need to also, and this is civil or justice or criminal, that you need to debrief with them after they've testified, particularly if they've gone through a cross-examination process. Because as LA said at the beginning, that can be an eviscerating experience. And, you know, while defense lawyers are required to give a robust and thorough defense, sometimes person's personal dignity and their rights of privacy and bodily integrity can get attacked, which is not within our Constitution or within the criminal code, and that is devastating. And people will leave that experience, civil or criminal, feeling they have ruined everything. And so calling for a recess, calling for a break to take 5 minutes to say, I know that was really hard, you did a great job. I know that, like, we'll talk more later, we're gonna unpack that later, but they have no idea that this is just how it goes. And they will leave that interaction thinking that they have just ruined everything. And that's devastating.
Leland, do you want to add to that, or?
I think that was fantastic. I have nothing to add.
Okay. So now I'm here we go. Trying to show you this little screen that says thank you. So we really appreciate you taking your time this evening to be with us. In particular, we want to thank our speakers, both Jen and Leland, who I can tell already from some of the feedback I've had through text that this has been very useful, very valuable, and I think is helping to bridge some of those silo conversations that plague a lot of our day-to-day work. So we would really encourage you to please fill out our evaluation survey for the webinar. Our funders like to know how we're doing, so it really does assist us. And again, if you have questions, you want to follow up with us, we really encourage you to reach out to both LA or myself. Creating these kinds of communities is a huge priority for the project.